What's up, George?
How you doing, brother?
man? I'm doing good. I'm very excited to talk to you because you've been with me for a little over a year now. So you are a brown belt under Joe DRC, and importantly, for what I want to talk about today, you were with the NYPD for 20 years, and you were a detective in particular for 10 years. So
Right.
definitely want to talk to you about why you think it's important for cops to train jiu-jitsu, what the benefits of that are, what you've seen the benefits of that to be, and maybe we can talk about some things that you think certain departments should change and restructure. So we'll start with this. What do you think are the main reasons that cops should train jiu-jitsu?
If there was ever a martial art that's customized for police work, it would be Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And the reason for that is, as a cop, you're going to have your hands on people in order to control them sooner or later. Whether the person's aggressive during an arrest situation because they're on drugs, they're on alcohol, they're mentally ill, whatever the case is, most arrests go without further incident. In other words, the people cooperate, but there are enough where the subjects are not cooperative, and you need to gain control of them. And you want to do it in a way that not only is it's efficient, but it looks good too, especially nowadays. Back in the day, even when I was on the job, if you had to strike people, that was just considered the norm. It's no longer acceptable, whether anyone has come out and made that official policy or not. Striking people is no longer acceptable.
Now, does it depend on the situation? Because there are some situations where obviously you might need to use a lot more force than others.
Yeah.
So, for instance, if someone has a weapon and you're trying to maintain control of the weapon, and striking them may help you with that, I'm assuming you'd be able to strike them, right?
Sure, at certain levels of force, certain incidents.
Right. But if
Depending
you're
on the
doing a good
circumstances.
job controlling them, then obviously you just maintain your ground control and you don't strike.
Right.
Okay.
What I'm talking about is the person who's maybe aggressively resisting arrest but doesn't have a weapon, isn't engaging in anything that anyone would consider to be life-threatening.
Right. Yeah, it's not acceptable to strike them. And I would agree. This is what I tell my students all the time. When you're faced with a threat, use as much force as necessary to stop the threat. But once the threat is stopped, you stop using force.
Right.
And also, your force should scale to the threat. So, if I'm fighting a 120-pound dude with no weapons and no martial arts training, it's like I'm not going to pick him up and slam him down on his head. It's going to be very easy for me to control him. Now, you take a 250-pound guy, who looks quite strong, even if they don't have training, which, in this situation, I don't know if they have training or not. Well, I'm going to be a lot more aggressive. I'm going to use a lot more force to restrain this person because they're bigger and stronger than me. So you're saying for police work, obviously, it scales the same way.
Right. And regardless of the circumstances, if you're well trained at subject control and you have to ramp it up, it becomes much easier to do. If you have to de-escalate, that becomes easy to do, the better trained you are.
Right. Well, because you have an underlying confidence that you're more likely to restrain the person once you're trained.
Right.
And have you noticed that you don't need to rely on the other tools that you have as much, be it a taser or a baton or things like that, once you're skilled in jiu-jitsu? I would imagine you would, right?
From what we see in studies that were done and from information from other organizations and police departments, yeah, the difference is drastic.
Yeah, so they've done comparative studies on departments that implement jiu-jitsu training and the ones that don't.
Yeah, there's not that many that have it mandated, but they're starting to come around. And within those departments, they're, of course, keeping statistics. So, yeah, the difference in injuries to the subject, injuries to the officers, just having to use less force, having to use a taser less.
Yeah. I imagine there's a lot less claims, too, that get filed because of that. It probably ends up saving the department money in the long term.
I don't have the stats on that, but I would imagine, yeah.
Yeah. And I think maybe cynically, what some of these cities have done is they've thought, well, we won't pay for the training and we'll settle more lawsuits, and maybe that'll be less money than if we pay for this expensive training and make it a mandated part of the job. Where now, maybe people don't want to do it, but. Yeah, obviously, if you're in a position where, like police represent the law, they represent the monopoly of violence of the government, right? Whatever level that you are. So how could you not be trained in implementing violence effectively and with as much control as necessary?
Right.
That seems crazy to me.
I think what's happening is you have the point of view of the police administration, and their whole thing is to spend as little money as humanly possible.
Right.
And if most of the members of the administration, like the police chiefs and the higher ranking officers, if they don't really train or know about training, or they can't see the value in training, they're not going to emphasize it, and they'll always have money set aside for lawsuits.
Right.
It's almost like it's an accepted part of the practice. Like, we know we're going to be sued.
Yeah, and it's been going on for so long, that the training just hasn't been mandatory. And to be fair, like 30 years ago, nobody knew what jiu-jitsu was. There were maybe a handful of black belts in the entire country, but now there's like tens of thousands of schools all throughout the U.S. and jiu-jitsu seems to be slowly breaking into mainstream culture. You're seeing a lot more celebrities, people with wealth train it, and that they speak on the benefits of it, and that makes me very optimistic that it's going to eventually become a very big part of mainstream American culture, and I think there's going to be a lot of benefit to that. And one of it will be that police officers will be strongly incentivized to train it,
right.
And that'll just be a cultural norm, So I think it would be very good, because obviously we don't want to see use of force incidents where someone gets hurt that they didn't need to get hurt,
right.
Or an officer gets hurt because they weren't trained in restraining somebody, and the suspect that they were trying to put to the ground and restrain, it was very strong, and maybe they hurt them, so we don't want to see that.
Well, in 2019, when the Marietta, Georgia Police Department went to mandatory training for their officers, it was over one incident. They had already been sending people to the GST, the Gracie Survival Tactics,
Mm-hmm.
but not all that information gets filtered down to everybody. And after this one incident, they were trying to control somebody in a fast food restaurant, I believe. And the officers there were multiple officers. They had the subject held down, and they were just punching him. And it just looked horrendous, and it looked ineffective. It looked completely inefficient, and it just made the officers look like they didn't know what they were doing, and they just weren't really good at their jobs.
Right.
So from that incident, Marietta started sending their officers to regular, consistent training, not just agency training, or not just sending them to a 5-day course. They started having their officers go to weekly training like anybody would do here.
Right. Yeah, and that's ultimately what you need. The idea that you can take a 6-week course, or God forbid, a weekend self-defense seminar, and be proficient at defending yourself or using force in a reasonable way if you're an officer is insane. So yeah, you need regular training, not only to learn new skills and sharpen your existing skills, but make sure that your knowledge doesn't deteriorate. It's something that you need to practice. It's the same thing with shooting at the range, right? If you don't go and shoot at the range for a while, then some of your maybe bad habits start coming back, or you're not as sharp as you were. So just like, I hope officers are regularly training with their firearms, I would hope that they would regularly train jiu-jitsu.
It's like this, some are and some aren't. But
that's why you got to mandate it.
Right. And you need that constant pressure. You just can't go in and train, and like at the range, you can't just go and put bullets down a target and not have any kind of pressure. You need like simulation training.
Yeah.
So that people understand what it's like to operate under the combat effects of stress, the physiological effects of stress. And if they don't have that, then the training really isn't all that good, and that's where we see a lot of problems come in.
So do most departments have that kind of stress training where they put them in specific circumstances?
I don't know how many do, but it's definitely more popular than it was back when I was younger. They recognize the need for it and that it has to be done. I'm just not sure. You watch some of the incidents on the news or on YouTube videos, and
on Twitter, which I'm very active on.
Or Twitter.
So I see a lot of it. Yeah.
But you can see that there definitely there needs to be more of that done. There's not enough of it.
Yeah.
Done.
One of the saddest videos that I watched was this officer restraining this very old lady. She must have been, in her 70s, maybe a little older even. And she had dementia. She had taken something from a store. It was like $20 worth of goods. It wasn't anything significant. And she's just wandering down the road. And so, the police officer approaches her, and she's not cooperating. So he goes to manipulate her and put her into the van. Now, this would be a very simple task for anyone with, blue belt, even like, a few months of white belt training. This would be a very easy thing for somebody to do without hurting her, right? Without harming her. But he's manipulating her arms behind her back to such an extreme degree that I could tell it was ripping her shoulder apart. You know, and the guy clearly didn't want to hurt her, but I could tell. I was cringing when I was watching the video because I could tell that she was breaking her shoulder apart. And when I read the underlying story under the video, yes, she suffered severe shoulder injuries, and it's just a completely awful preventable thing.
Right.
You know, and obviously even if she has dementia, she's going to have severe trauma from that incident. So these are very simple things that you can prevent just with a little bit of training. You know,
Sure.
So it's just really sad to see. You know, like, this person is resisting, but you know they're not a threat to the officer or anything like that. And even in a situation like that, someone who doesn't seem like they have malintent can really mess up and hurt somebody. So that makes, in my mind, the training just absolutely necessary. Like, it should be completely mandated. And you know, not to mention when someone is actually a threat to you.
Right.
You know, like, if somebody is within 21 feet, I think that they teach you guys this, right? If someone's within 21 feet, there's a good chance they're going to make it to you before you can draw your firearm, right? And in that case, you're likely going to be in a grappling situation.
Basically, at 21 feet, it takes a second and a half for you to perceive a threat and draw your firearm and get 2 rounds down.
Unless you're extremely fast.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
But
it takes a quarter of a second just to perceive a threat.
Yeah.
So, you know, somebody could cover that distance in fairly quickly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Getting back to that old woman, once you figure out what's going on, might be just as easy to go back to the store and pay for her stuff.
Yeah.
And call it a day.
Yeah, I mean, definitely agree with that. You know, it's like she has dementia. I think that's a clear case where an officer should use discretion and be like,
Yep.
all right, look, I'll pay your $20 of stuff. You know, that's good community policing.
Right.
You know, but you know, outside of that, you know, talking about other prominent incidents, I think we should talk about George Floyd and sort of the after effects that incident had. So, you know, the first thing I'll say is, like, I don't think the officers had a great degree of training. It took 4 people to restrain one guy, although he's very big, right? He's clearly a very big guy, over 200 pounds tall. But it shouldn't take 4 officers, you know, applying a lot of pressure towards him to restrain him.
Right.
That being said, you know, I don't think, like, if you look at the autopsy report, you know, where he had enough fentanyl to kill me and you
Right.
know, maybe not some very heavy users that have resistance to it, but you know, he's clearly on drugs and going nuts in the car. He himself in the longer video asked to be put down, but it's not so much what the officers did that they made mistakes, which they did, but the after effects that had, right? It made policing not only less safe for the officers, but less safe for the suspects. So, you know, you're in the NYPD. I'm sure you followed this, but following George Floyd, one of the things that they did is they made basic pins illegal for officers to do, to where it could be a misdemeanor, right? Side control, misdemeanor. Mount, misdemeanor, right? Knee on belly, knee on back, right? Misdemeanors.
Right.
So when you make those basic pins illegal, what you see is more use of the taser, more use of the baton, right? Which is much more dangerous. People die from tasers all the time. There's like 1,000 deaths from tasers every year. They're not non-lethal. They're less than lethal, right? It's better than using a firearm in terms of, you know, the suspect's ability to survive, but definitely not as good as Jiu-Jitsu and holding somebody in side control. I mean, that's just insane, you know. So what do you think about that?
So that was done in New York City. They called it the, I forget what the rule is called. Oh, the diaphragm rule. You can't put pressure on somebody's torso anywhere near their upper body or their diaphragm. Luckily, that wasn't done countrywide, because it's ridiculous. Yeah, you need to put weight on somebody to control them, but you need to do it in a way that you understand exactly what's happening.
Right.
And it's another good reason to do this type of training, to do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu training, because obviously we have our weight on each other all the time, and we understand. Another thing we'll understand is, after 9 minutes of having your weight on somebody, it shouldn't take 9 minutes, first of all.
Oh, the average person is going to gas after like 60 seconds.
Right, and you understand what is actually taking place in the body, and that, you know, you need to get off the person at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, not everybody is controlled. Not everybody is trained to control their breathing when someone is being heavy on them, you know, and obviously size discrepancies matter, you know. So going back to George Floyd, you got 4 guys, right? 2 of them putting pressure on his chest, 1 putting pressure on the back of his neck. Wasn't the front of the neck, right? It was the back of the neck. But regardless, right? You got someone who's on drugs, and you're putting weight on them, right? It's not helping the situation. That being said, right? Somebody who is trained in jiu-jitsu can do it safely, right? Or at least with minimal risk. There's always a risk that somebody has an underlying medical issue that's going to, when they're in a stressful situation, they're resisting arrest. They might get a heart attack, or they might have a stroke. But you can't control for that because what's the other option? That you beat them with a baton or a taser, and if they have that situation, you use a taser on them, they're probably going to die anyway.
Right. Well, there's a few things there to unpack. One, I think George Floyd was on his way to dying regardless of what the cops did.
Yeah.
Two, they put him on the ground and they had him controlled. From there, the fear for cops is that somebody handcuffed can still fight. They can still kick. They can still get up. They can cause damage. I've seen it done throughout my career. But they had him controlled on the ground in such a way that if they were better trained and he did try to get up or he did try to kick or he tried to do anything aggressive, they would have felt a lot more confident in controlling him. They wouldn't have felt the need to keep him pinned down to the ground until the ambulance showed up, or not keep him pinned with that much body weight.
With that much pressure.
Right, the whole time. That's what would have made the difference.
Absolutely. So, obviously you disagree with the NYPD rules.
No, it's ridiculous. Because a cop can fall across the person in the dynamics of a violent confrontation. They could just fall across them.
Boom, misdemeanor.
Yeah, and subject themselves to possible imprisonment. Over what? Are you trying to control somebody who's being violent?
Yeah, and they wonder why cops are leaving the force.
Right.
Yeah, and moving elsewhere, or just not risking it. I've seen videos of them using the baton to just beat people.
Well, they just won't get involved at all.
Yeah.
They just won't get involved at all.
Wow.
I saw a video of a cop trying to arrest a combative subject in the transit system, on the stairs in the subway, and his partner just stood there watching, didn't do a thing. And you're thinking, well, maybe the guy's a coward, but it's not so much that he was afraid of the physical confrontation. They're afraid of the aftermath.
Right.
They're afraid of doing something and then going to jail. So if you don't do anything, and I'm not suggesting that this is good strategy, but if you don't do anything, then you can't go to jail for doing nothing.
Well, that is the incentive structure that the city councilors in New York City have created, and,
right.
And they're going to suffer the results of that, which is less people are going to want to become cops. The cops that you do have, are going to leave. Or they're just going to wait it out and get their pension and then retire, and you won't be able to replace them.
Right.
And eventually, it just is a downward spiral. And some of the prosecutions too, with regards to use of force for self-defense, have just been insane. You remember that guy that he was being violent. He was being violently attacked by somebody who was robbing a store, and he used a knife in self-defense. Yep. Right, stabbed him, killed him.
Yes.
And he was so severely injured by the robber that he was in the hospital bed. Right. They handcuffed him to his hospital bed and charged him with murder. Right. And this is the political situation that you have now over there, where cops can be criminalized for holding someone inside control and trying to restrain someone with a reasonable use of force. And at the same time, right, civilians, if they use self-defense, they'll be maliciously prosecuted. Although there was enough public pressure in that case that the charges were dropped, but they should have never even been put on the guy in the first place. It's just absolutely insane. But that's the situation that you've got. People are afraid of defending themselves. They're afraid of standing up against people on the subway terrorizing people, and the cops don't have the incentive structure to intervene. You could almost say that it's on purpose, but regardless of whether it's stupidity or malice, that's the situation, and it's no wonder that cops are moving elsewhere. They're going to Texas or they're going to Florida.
Yeah, there's definitely a political narrative, a political strategy to outlaw self-defense for anybody. Probably a topic for another video.
I mean, we can talk. We can talk briefly about it. I do want to get back into talking more about policing and training jiu-jitsu. But yeah, I mean, I think that's the obvious strategy.
Yeah.
Why was Rittenhouse prosecuted? It was the most insanely obvious case of self-defense I've ever seen. Right? There were people on the left that were saying that, by the way, that it was an obvious case of self-defense. Well, why was he prosecuted? Because they want to instill fear in people if they defend themselves, that the system will come after them. Right. And eventually, right, they want to disarm people.
Yeah.
Like these little, oh, it's just, this is just reasonable self-defense laws or reasonable gun control. But the people that are advocating this, right, they don't want you to have the right to defend your life. They don't want you to have the right to defend your property. They don't want you to have the right to have a firearm, right? They want the state to have a firearm, right? They seem to have a problem with police officers using excessive force, but they're fine with them having the firearms, right? They don't want the civilians to have the firearms.
Right.
That's just the way that I see it. It's a complete contradiction. Unless you realize that they're trying to take your autonomy away, they're trying to take your ability to defend yourself away.
Right.
That's just how I see it. But going back to policing, right? Another fallout of what you saw was the call to defund the police or abolish the police, right? Which abolish the police is just completely insane. The one place where they tried it in Minneapolis, they completely reversed. They completely reversed that policy afterwards. And the defund the police narrative is thankfully seemed to be completely destroyed and discredited, which is a good thing. But, obviously when it comes to funding, right, the idea isn't to have a massive budget. The idea is to have a smart budget. So, what are some things that you think, police administration can do to not increase expenses too much, but also make sure that their officers have the training that they need and that they're being consistent with it?
Yeah, that's a good question. As far as officers going and getting training on their own, they should absolutely do it whether the department is paying for it or not. The departments should, if they can, if it's feasible, every police department's different. If they can, they should try to at least partly fund cops getting better training. And the reason is that police departments and agencies won't have to spend as much money in suspects getting hurt, lawsuits, officers getting hurt, losing time at work. There's so many reasons to pay for better training.
Right. From just a pure financial incentive.
Yeah. So I think that needs to be looked at a little bit further. And the administrations who aren't taking part or don't know about it should look at the ones that are and just see what they're doing and how they're saving money. With a big police department like the NYPD, I don't know if that'll ever happen. But whether or not the agencies pay for it, cops need to do it on their own.
Well, with enough will, with enough will behind it, I think it could.
Yeah.
But it's only one department of many in the country, and you can see the difference in competence and outcome as well. From the training structure.
Some of the departments are using money from asset forfeiture seizures and getting private donations as well from different organizations.
Yeah, it makes sense. And I don't know exactly what their agreement is, but I know that Gustavo Machado's school, that school in Sarasota, they have a deal with the city police of Sarasota where the officers get free training there.
Right.
And I think that's a great thing, and I think more departments should look into pursuing something like that to make sure that their officers are getting regular training. But like you said, not every department is doing it, and some officers are having to go out individually and do it. And it's not just you. I've got several other police officers that train with us. And again, good on them. I'm super happy about it, and obviously they've gotten way better since they started. But to the officer that says, I just don't have the money, or I just don't have the time, or I'm afraid of the injury risk of me training. What do you say to address their concerns, and what should they do?
So there are several things. One, there's programs out there like Adopt a BJJ Cop. There's schools all across the country that are participating in it. I think there's 31, if I'm not mistaken, in Florida that participate in it, and they'll pay for your training, or at least partially pay for it, up until you're a blue belt. That's a pretty good deal.
That's a really good deal. That's at least a year of training most of the time.
There are other schools that just allow cops to come in and train for free or at a discount rate.
Yeah,
I don't
both myself and my instructor have a discounted rate.
Yeah, I think a discount rate is better. I like for everybody to have a little bit of skin in the game.
I appreciate that.
And for cops themselves, if they can't get into a program like one of the ones I just mentioned, you have to make the sacrifice somewhere. Maybe, maybe a gym membership, a BJJ school membership instead of a gym membership. Maybe don't go out 5 nights a week.
Yeah.
You can find the money somewhere.
Yeah, usually when you do a deep dive into your budget, you can find it,
And I think most school owners are willing to work with you.
I'm 100% willing to work with cops if they.
I haven't
need a
met
little
one
bit of
yet
help.
that has a problem with it.
Yeah, of course, because the average person is just much less likely to use this skill set than a cop,
Right.
in their day to day. And there have been several police officers that have trained with me or with my instructor that have come back with stories of like how they use jiu-jitsu to defend themselves. And
Yeah.
civilians have come to me too,
Right.
with stories, which is great. But obviously, you just hear more of it from police officers. Like one of my instructor students, he had been training jiu-jitsu for 6 months. He was a correctional officer, right, and he got attacked while he was in prison. And he was alone with this guy for several minutes while everyone was like scrambling to get to him. And he credits jiu-jitsu with surviving, right? He suffered damage, right? But he was able to maintain his guard and maintain enough distance and avoid enough of the strikes that he was able to survive this guy that was obviously trying to kill him. So, that's just one incident. I've had cops tell me that they're just much more easily able to control people that are being violent and resisting just about using jiu-jitsu. And that's a great thing, and I want that to be expanded to everybody, right?
Right.
This should just be a typical part of training.
I think for cops who train also, they just fare better emotionally and psychologically. And it's good to train with regular non-law enforcement citizens as well. That way you're not just with cops all the time. And, you get to hear their fears and their concerns, or just learn about them as people.
Yeah.
And it takes away from that us against them mentality.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think I'll expand it beyond just cops. I think it's good for everybody to train jiu-jitsu because you're in an environment of people that in your day-to-day work circles, social circles, you won't see, right? So I've got lots of people in trades that train with me, right? I've got lots of people that work desk jobs, that work white-collar jobs that work here, and I've got cops, I've got stoners too.
Right.
Right. Jiu-jitsu attracts stoners. It is what it is.
It's a reflection of society.
Yeah, that's right. And it's like, where else will you find a group of people where you'll be in such a high trust environment in which everyone's strangling each other, and there's an innate understanding that we're doing this to get better and train, and we're not trying to hurt each other. Yeah, it definitely builds a very strong bond with people from different areas.
And
of
it
life.
works both ways. Like they get to know you, they get to know the officers that train with them as well.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really good thing, because
I agree.
When Sonny was here,
Yeah.
after training with him for a while and speaking to him, somehow it came up that I was a retired NYPD detective, and he went, "You were a cop?" And I was like, "Yeah, why?" And he said, "You just seem so chill, so relaxed." And I was like, what is your perception of cops? I was like, "We're all just regular people." It's like, no, they're usually they're a little meaner, a little more aggressive. They're a little angrier. He's like, "You don't seem like that at all. You seem pretty happy-go-lucky." So,
yeah. Well,
it works both ways.
Every cop is different, right?
Right.
We were talking once, and you told me the undercover cops are different than your normal cops.
Yeah.
I think that's a great story. Why don't you tell me a little bit about some of the undercover encounters that you've had?
So, being a detective in Brooklyn North Narcotics for 5 years, I got to work with a lot of great undercovers. I mean, really fantastic people doing things that I could never do, and most cops can't. But I always said they had that certain amount of flake about them. And what I mean, I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean, they're a little different. They're a little off, you might say, in a way that most people will never suspect them as being a cop.
Right.
They don't give off a cop vibe in any way, shape, or form. They're able to lie really well. And they're able
have to be able to lie.
Yeah, they're able to think on their feet and just make up stories. I've heard on wires, my undercovers being grilled, like, "Are you a cop?" And they're like, "What are you talking about? I hate cops." In fact, that happened to one of my undercovers where a couple of his former coworkers from another command within the police department recognized him while he was with a drug dealer.
Oh, man.
And they went, "Hey," and they said his name, and he goes, "Well, who are you talking to?" And they go, "You're so-and-so, we work together." And he's like, "I don't know what you're talking about. And I'm hearing this on the wire, and I'm like, holy mac, we better get ready to go in.
Yeah.
And he just went, nah, you're probably thinking of my cousin. He looks like me. He worked with you guys, like that. And the drug dealer turned to him, to the undercover, and said, that's crazy. I thought you were a cop. And he goes, I hate cops. And that was it. He's like, I don't know these guys. And that was it. And that was good enough for the drug dealer. And that was the end of it. But for a few seconds, it was really tense. But I couldn't believe how calm he stayed and how well he handled it. But they all have that.
Yeah. There's a different breed.
There is.
That's really cool. Well, they do an important job, you know?
Yeah.
That's awesome. So any other cool stories from your 20 years experience?
There's so many. There really is so many. People always want to hear action stories, and I have some of those too, but one of the funnier ones I tell is I think I told you this one. I was walking a beat at the time, so I was in uniform, and a school crossing guard came up to me and said, pretty sure there's a stolen car on the corner. So I went out and I looked, and I was like, yeah, you're right. So I had to call for the next tow to come to pick up the car and impound it. So I have about 30 minutes before the tow truck comes. So I need to find a way to entertain myself for those 30 minutes. So I told the school crossing guard to get off the corner. In the meantime, I walk by a woman and a man fighting, and I hear the woman telling the man, just leave it alone. Don't go over there. You're going to get in trouble. So I was thinking, is this guy the car thief, or is he looking to take the car? Mm. And then they walk away. So I go, and just in case he's going to come back, I get into the car, which doesn't have a back seat. So I lay down on the back seat in full uniform, turned my radio down low, and I wasn't in there a minute, and I could feel the car shake because he leaned on it like that, and he looked up and down the block. I'm looking up at him. He can't see me. He goes to the other side, does the same thing, looks up and down. He does the perp scan, looking up and down the block. With that, opens the door, slides across the seat, and next thing I hear is him go, So I'm trying not to laugh.
Like a cartoon.
Exactly. And he starts trying to hotwire the car. So I compose myself, and I come up real slowly, and I just grab him by the jaw so I can pull his head back. But his head went into the headrest, but he was looking straight up. And when I did that, I went, what are you doing in my car? And I yelled it, and his arms and legs went like this, and he made the most horrified face I've ever seen a human make, that it was so comical that I struggled to hold him, and he was able to open the door and get out and run. And there are people on the corner watching, and they're going, George, he ran this way, he's going this way. And I went, I'm holding my stomach. I was like, I can't chase him. I can't run. I was just laughing too hard. But yeah, I called for a car to bring me in so I could do the paperwork. And I said, they were like, you want to ride? And I said, yeah. I was like, I have to go tell this story. This is great. But yeah, he got away. But legend had it that the NYPD was putting cops in stolen cars all in that neighborhood. And that block was known for dumped cars.
Yeah.
And there wasn't another stolen car on that block for like the next 6 months.
Oh, wow. That's awesome. Well, there you go. So he might have gotten away, but net positive impact there.
Right.
Well, very cool. That's awesome, man. Yeah, I have a lot of respect for cops because it is a very, very difficult job. Not only do you have to face the potential of getting into a physical altercation, but you have to know the law. You have to use reasonable judgment in many, many different kinds of circumstances. You have to be able to tell when somebody's lying or
right.
When something suspicious is going on. And that takes a lot of skill and know-how. It's definitely a hard job. So
it's even harder now than when I was there. I retired in 2007, and the job has become much more complex now.
So in what ways would you say?
Mostly because everybody has a cell phone. So that means everybody has a cell phone camera. So you can be, and I'm not saying that it's a bad thing. A cop should be able to do his job and be videotaped, and it shouldn't be a problem. But you have people now videotaping every single stop that they can, every single encounter with the police, and trying to make it into a bad thing. Mm. They're editing out certain portions of the video to make it look bad, especially if the cop has to use force.
Yeah, you should never trust an edited video.
Yeah,
until you've seen the whole thing.
On a lot of these videos, you never see the beginning of the video.
Yeah. There's like I forget who it was. I'm on Twitter a lot, like I said, but they have a rule. They said, if if some story gets leaked or some narrative is presented, right, give it 48 hours before you make a judgment on it,
Right.
because there's always going to be another perspective that gets brought up, or there's more evidence to whatever's going on. So
Right.
yeah, that makes sense to me.
But the mainstream media doesn't do that. They go with
oh no,
whatever
no.
whatever's going to fit the narrative.
Yeah, and what they do is very cynical, because they can be factual without being truthful.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
They can present certain facts which are true, but will not present surrounding context, which will be more truthful.
Right.
To those facts. So like there's many cases where you'll see a headline like white cop shoots unarmed black suspect, right? And it's like, oh my God, this white cop shot this unarmed black suspect. Like, what happened? And then you watch the video, the body cam video, and it eventually comes out, and the suspect reached for the officer's firearm.
Right.
You know what I mean? Or they're charging at him, and they're a big guy.
Right.
And you have to put them down because the cop is just much smaller, and they can't restrain a violent person coming at them without using lethal means.
Right.
So you got to be very careful. And like I said, the 48-hour rule is a good rule. And by the way, this isn't a left versus right thing. Okay, it happens on every side of the spectrum. Right. Everyone has their own biases. Everyone has their own way that they try to present things.
Right.
Hopefully, you as a person will develop truth-conducive biases, where you'll try to be truthful and give important context, even if it goes against, the narrative that you believe is predominant or whatever. I think that's something that we should really pursue and try to be objective about things. But realistically, right, there are people on both sides of the political aisle, in all fields, in all domains, that will lie or will at least manipulate you with framing and with the language that they use, and you've got to be very careful. It happens to scientists too. There was actually just recently this behavioral economist that had won a bunch of awards, and had done work for like the past decade, and some guy discovered that he'd been completely faking his data, right? And it's just a complete scumbag thing to do,
right?
So, because academia relies on trust and goodwill, right? And if you break that by falsifying data, right, it brings the reputation down of the entire institution.
Sure.
Although I think, sometimes it's deserved. But the way that they found it out was because he was making a claim that relied on driving data, of people who drove a long time versus people who drive a lot versus people who don't. And a lot of times you can tell data is faked if the distribution is way off compared to what a normal distribution would be. So, in every other study that uses driving data, right? Most people drive a moderate amount, right? Some people drive very little, some people drive a lot. So it's a normal distribution. The curve is like this, and the curve for his data was like this. It was like flat. There was like an even distribution of people that drove a lot to, like not very much to a moderate amount, and you just never see that. So that's how he got found out that the data was fake. So anyway, people in every domain, people in every field will try to deceive you. There are bad actors in every field, and,
Sure.
And you have to be on the lookout for that, including in jiu-jitsu, guys, right? There's, just because somebody has a black belt doesn't mean they're a good guy, right? It tells you something about them. They're probably a hard worker. They're probably reasonably disciplined, but it doesn't tell you that they're a good person, right? There's plenty of black belts that, are not good people, or at the very least, have dysfunctional lives, and you shouldn't probably take their advice on a lot of things outside of jiu-jitsu.
Right.
So you got to be careful. Same thing with cops, right?
Human condition.
Yeah, there's a lot there's a lot of good cops. There's some bad cops that get into it for the wrong reasons because it's a means for them to exercise authority over others.
Right.
But at the end of the day, what you want is a system that weeds as many of those people out as possible and produces good outcomes. And I think training jiu-jitsu is going to produce more good outcomes.
I believe that as well. Somebody asked me recently if some of the realistic TV shows, realistic cop TV shows, are they really accurate? And I said, what the problem is? I said, a lot of their storylines come from actual incidents. I was like, obviously, the timelines get compressed for the TV show to keep it entertaining, and they don't show you the hours of boredom that are mixed in with, sheer terror for seconds at a time. But the other thing is, in a lot of the movies nowadays, they make it like there's one good cop amongst an agency of all bad cops. And it's really the complete opposite.
Yeah.
I've been really fortunate in my career. I worked with a lot of great people. I'm talking about real heroes. And I've worked with very, very few bad cops. One in particular, one of the bad cops I worked with is I think he's in jail for life. But I think he got a 75-year sentence, which would for him is
Basically
probably going to
life,
be
yeah.
life. But he was just a bad person. But we meaning the people that worked with him, had no way of knowing. He did his job at work. He was fine. He didn't do anything out of line or corrupt or anything that not that I could see anyway. That could be
I think the
misconstrued.
smart ones don't.
Yeah,
Kind of hide it.
but off duty, he was doing armed robberies. He killed somebody, tried to kill two people. That's how he got caught. One of them survived.
Man.
But even my own father, I'm watching the news with him at the time when it happened, and I went, "Oh, I work with that guy," and he goes, "Didn't you know he was bad?" And I was like, "How would I know?" I was like, "He did his job. He was a happy guy, well-adjusted, got along with everybody, had a smile on his face every day."
A lot of psychopaths are like that.
Complete sociopath.
Very personable, but obviously they hide the darkness.
Yeah, but my father couldn't believe I had no clue. I was like, "Dad, I didn't know." He gave no indication whatsoever. He did this off duty alone, and he was just like shaking his head in disbelief.
There's a story. I don't know if it was Jocko that told the story or somebody else, but it was about a Navy SEAL. Like really good at his job. Got along with his teammates.
Serial
really
killer?
well. Yeah, the guy who ate people.
Andy Stump tells that story.
Okay.
He was a former Navy SEAL with a podcast as well, but he was the honor man in Andy Stump's class. Like he's the guy that did the best.
Yeah,
in
top of the line.
Yeah, in
But he's
this
a
SEAL
serial
class.
killer.
Serial killer, and he was able to hook up with a woman who was just as sociopathic as he was.
Yeah. Amazing how they find each other.
Right?
I wonder how they can recognize one another. But I think what is really illustrated by that is there is no screening process that you can possibly have that will eliminate 100% of those people.
No.
And obviously you've got to be very careful and try to sniff out as many as you can. But some people will always push through. I mean, there's like 800,000 cops in the entire country, right? You really think every single one is an upstanding person? No, obviously there's psychopaths and sociopaths amongst them,
Right.
just like everything else, and you want to weed them out. But the narrative that every cop is bad is nuts. Now I will say this, cops embody the law. When the law is just, I think cops get viewed very favorably. When the law is just and it's enforced justly, they get viewed very favorably. Mm-hmm. When the laws are unjust and tyrannical, right, even if they have good intentions, they're going to be viewed negatively, including by me.
Right.
So if you're a cop, you have to be aware of that. Like if you're being made to enforce an immoral law, you should consider perhaps leaving and joining another department that won't somewhere else, which won't force you to do that. One of the things that was brought up by somebody that watched Michael Malice. In New Jersey, there was this old lady that was passing through the state. Right, she had her concealed license from another state. Now in New Jersey, at the time, you were not allowed to have a firearm. It's like it's a felony. So she's driving through. She has in her glove compartment. She's going somewhere else. Right, she's driving through the state. She's not even going to the state. She gets pulled over. Right, and unfortunately for her, she mentions to the officer that she has a firearm, right? It's like, here's my concealed. I just want to let you know it's in my glove compartment or whatever. Like being really respectful, and she gets arrested, right? Gets charged with a felony. That's crazy. I would never enforce that law. I would get fired before I did that.
No, I wouldn't have enforced that either.
Yeah.
And
even if I had a body camera on me, I would have not enforced it.
I know for a fact there are other cops that wouldn't enforce it.
I'm happy to hear that, and I've talked to some of them in here. They said like, "Oh yeah, I would have never done that."
But there are some that will.
Yeah, there are some that will. And you gotta really make sure you know where the line is, because there's all sorts of examples throughout history where when the state with a monopoly on violence, right, gets taken over by a tyrannical force, right? Who becomes the enforcers of that tyranny, right? It's going to be the police. It's going to be law enforcement. So, just be very careful if that ever happens in the future. Hopefully it doesn't, that you're not one of the ones that just go along with it.
Right,
so.
Right. I agree with that.
Well, I thought that was really awesome. So bottom line, right? Cops, you got to train jiu-jitsu.
Absolutely. If you're not training now, you should be. At least look into it.
Yeah.
Find
and the
out what it's
programs you
about.
mentioned, Adopt a Cop, right? Are there any others that will help subsidize your training that people
Look
can look
into the Invictus Law Enforcement Collective. It's all Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu cops, and their organization promotes making training mandatory and just promotes BJJ for cops. And they do their own studies. They did have a podcast for a while, but I don't think it's been up and active lately. But their website is, and you can find out more about BJJ and law enforcement.
Awesome.
I think there's even a Florida-based organization, BJJ Cops. They're out of Jacksonville, and they do training. All the training is done by either active duty or retired cops who are in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Yeah, and I mentioned Adopt a BJJ Cop before. But there's probably other organizations I don't even know about.
Yeah, or just find a gym that will give you.
Worst comes to worst, yeah. Just go to.
And it's not just me and my instructor. That's very common, where law enforcement will get a discounted rate. Because we understand how important this is for you guys.
Yeah.
So
there are nearly 34,000 BJJ schools in this country, so there's one by you somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah, they're everywhere, man.
Yeah.
We're growing. And, it's good. I think we got a lot of cultural momentum going in our direction, and I think it's not just cops that are going to all be training, but I think in the general populace, you're going to see more and more and more people start to train. So, 25 years from now, right, jiu-jitsu could be very, very popular, right? I mean,
sure.
25 years ago, almost nobody did it, and now look where we are. We
right.
could be pretty far ahead 25 years from now, so
yep.
It's exciting.
It is.
All right, George, thanks very much, man.
Okay,
Appreciate
thank
talking
you.
with you.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, guys, for watching the video. Make sure you share it if you found this interesting. If you're a cop, make sure you go out and train. Share this with your buddies. If you know a cop that you think should train, which you guys all should, share this video with them. Smash the thumbs up button. If you guys found anything interesting that you want to comment on or something that you disagreed with, make sure you drop a comment. Thanks a lot for watching, guys. We'll see you next time.